It all started innocently enough, as these things often do. I was just another office worker in a mid-sized company, one of many working under Karen, my 60-year-old boss. She was well-respected, authoritative, and had been in the industry for decades. I was much younger than most of the employees in the department, fresh out of college and eager to make a name for myself. My career was just beginning, and I was excited about all the possibilities ahead of me. Karen had always been a bit of a mystery to most of us. She kept a professional distance from the team, but occasionally offered little nuggets of wisdom, something I interpreted as her way of guiding the younger generation. She was a little stern, perhaps too demanding at times, but it was nothing that raised alarm bells. I had only been with the company for about 6 months when things took a darker turn. The first sign came after I completed a major project that earned high praise from upper management. Karen pulled me aside that afternoon and invited me into her office to discuss the work. At first I was excited. Praise from Karen was rare, and the opportunity to get feedback from someone so experienced was invaluable. I remember the way she motioned toward the chair opposite her desk with a casual smile. She seemed more relaxed than usual, as though she were just another colleague, not the towering authority figure she usually was. We started talking, and everything felt normal, professional. She complimented my attention to detail, my work ethic, and how quickly I'd adapted to the corporate environment. The conversation started to shift when she brought up her own experiences as a young professional, navigating the challenges of the corporate world. She began to speak about the personal sacrifices she made to rise through the ranks, the long hours, the toll it took on her relationships, and how, sometimes, you have to be willing to do anything to succeed. Her words, while cryptic, didn't fully register at the time, but looking back, they were the first warning signs. Things escalated when Karen began requesting that I stay late more often. At first, it seemed reasonable enough. There were deadlines, and we had a lot of work to do. I was young and hungry for success, so I didn't think twice about the extra hours. But the late-night meetings with her in her office became more frequent, and I started to notice that the conversations often veered away from work. She would talk about her personal life, ask about mine, and probe into areas that felt a little too intimate for a professional setting. One night, after everyone had left the office, Karen called me into her office again. I was tired, mentally drained, but I didn't think I could refuse. She closed the door behind me, and the atmosphere felt different, heavier. I took a seat, expecting another long conversation about work-life balance or her experiences as a woman in a male-dominated industry, but instead, she sat on the edge of her desk, uncomfortably close. "You've done really well, she said softly, her tone low and intimate. "I think you have a lot of potential, but there's something I need to know." I remember sitting there, unsure of where the conversation was headed. "What do you mean?" I asked. Her smile was thin, almost predatory. "How far are you willing to go to succeed?" I froze. The question felt wrong, out of place, but I didn't know how to respond. She reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, her fingers trailing down my arm in a way that made my skin crawl. I wanted to get up, to leave, but something about the situation kept me rooted in place. "You don't have to answer now," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "but just think about it." That night, I went home feeling uneasy, disturbed even, but I couldn't quite pinpoint why. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe Karen was just being overly familiar, that it wasn't as sinister as it seemed. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Karen's behavior became increasingly inappropriate. She would brush against me in the hallway, her touches lingering longer than necessary. She'd make suggestive comments, veiled under the guise of jokes. And then there were the closed-door meetings where she would sit too close, her eyes roaming over me in a way that made my stomach twist. Each time I felt more and more trapped. I didn't know who to turn to. Karen was the head of the department, respected by everyone. If I said anything, who would believe me? A young employee accusing a well-established, successful woman of crossing boundaries. It felt impossible. The breaking point came one Friday evening. The office was empty, and I was finishing up some reports when Karen called me into her office. I hesitated for a moment, but I went. As soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was different. Karen wasn't sitting behind her desk. Instead, she stood by the window, gazing out at the city skyline. "I've been thinking a lot about you," she said without turning around. My heart raced. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent. "You've shown a lot of promise," she continued, finally turning to face me. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were dark and tense. "But there are certain things, certain sacrifices you have to make if you want to get ahead." She took a step closer, and my body tensed. I wanted to run, to escape, but the door was behind her, and I felt trapped. "You understand what I'm saying, don't you?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. I shook my head, trying to act confused, hoping that maybe I was misunderstanding, but I wasn't. Karen closed the distance between us, her hand reaching out to touch my face. "You're smart. You'll figure it out." The next moments felt like a blur, a nightmare. Karen leaned in, her breath hot against my skin as she whispered things I never thought I'd hear from someone in her position. She told me that I could have anything I wanted in the company: a promotion, a raise, respect if I was willing to give her what she wanted. I felt sick. My mind screamed at me to get out, to leave, but I couldn't move. She was my boss, someone I was supposed to respect, someone who held my entire career in her hands. I didn't know what to do. She didn't give me much of a choice. I remember the coldness of her hands, the way she forced herself on me, and the helplessness that flooded my body as she took control. I wanted to fight, to scream, but I felt paralyzed, terrified of what would happen if I resisted. The power dynamic between us was overwhelming. I was young, inexperienced, and she was the head of the department, someone who had the authority to destroy my career if she wanted to. The worst part wasn't just the physical violation, but the emotional manipulation. Karen made it clear that if I didn't comply, she would make my life hell at work. She could ruin my reputation, spread rumors, or simply fire me without consequence. I felt completely powerless. When it was over, she straightened her clothes, smiled, and acted as though nothing had happened. She told me I'd done well, like I was some kind of object, and that I'd be hearing about a promotion soon. Then she walked out of the office, leaving me there, shattered. I sat in that office for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't believe it. This kind of thing was supposed to happen in the dark corners of Reddit, in stories about bosses abusing their power, not in my life. I was numb, confused, and terrified about what the future held. I tried to act normal the next day at work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew what had happened. I felt dirty, ashamed, and deeply betrayed by someone I had once looked up to. Karen, on the other hand, acted like nothing had changed. She smiled at me during meetings, praised my work in front of others, and continued to give me more responsibilities, as if everything was fine. I considered quitting, but the job market was tough, and I couldn't afford to leave without another position lined up. I was trapped, forced to endure the presence of the woman who had violated me. Every time I saw her, I felt sick to my stomach, but I didn't know what to do. Eventually, I turned to the internet for help. Late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I found myself scrolling through Reddit, reading stories of others who had experienced similar situations. I found threads about workplace harassment, power imbalances, and stories from people who had been taken advantage of by those in positions of authority. It was both comforting and horrifying to know that I wasn't alone. I debated posting my own story, but the fear of being recognized, of someone connecting the dots, kept me silent. Still, reading those stories helped me realize that what had happened wasn't my fault. Karen had abused her power, and I wasn't to blame for her actions. Over time, I began to distance myself from Karen. I stopped working late, avoided one-on-one meetings, and did everything I could to minimize contact with her. It wasn't easy. She noticed the shift and made passive-aggressive comments, but I stood my ground. Eventually, she started to back off, perhaps realizing that I wasn't going to be as compliant as she had hoped. I never reported what happened. I wish I could say that I did, that I took a stand and exposed Karen for what she was, but the fear of losing my job, of being blacklisted in the industry, kept me silent. I lived with the guilt and shame for a long time, wondering if I had made the right choice by staying quiet. To this day, I still think about what happened. I've moved on to a different job, in a different city, far away from Karen, and the toxic environment she created, but the scars remain. It's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life: the betrayal, the violation, and the helplessness of being forced into a situation I never asked for. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes in the form of a smile from someone you thought you could trust,